In this episode of Grief in Common, we mention suicide and talk about chronic illness, death and grief throughout.
Welcome back to the Grief in Common podcast. Today's episode is a special one as we are joined by members of the Teapot Trust, who Winston's Wish have been collaborating with over the past couple of weeks to bring you this episode full of our experiences with grief and chronic illness. My name's Abigail, I'm 21 and I lost my older sister when I was 13.
Hello, my name is Ryan, I'm 25 and I lost my granddad in 2021.
Hi, I'm Beth, I'm 27 just, and I lost my best friend in my first year of uni.
Hi, I'm Ella, I am 21 and I lost my best friend in 2023.
Hi, my name's Eden. I'm 21. My pronouns are she, her, and I lost 3 members of my family last year in 2024. I was unable to make the podcast recordings due to my chronic illness, hence why these clips are recorded separately, but I still wanted to be able to share my views.
In this special episode of the podcast, we'll be exploring how chronic illness can overlap with your grief journey through looking at the personal impacts, social impacts, and some of the medical impacts that you may not have anticipated before you started your grief journey.
Grief is really difficult for everybody, but there's an added complexity when you're chronically ill because, as we know, a lot of us, stress is not the best thing for our bodies, and grief is surprisingly stressful. It's upsetting and it's difficult, so it can have a real impact on your physical health.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that's really difficult to prepare for if it's your first time grieving when you're chronically ill, or if you've not experienced grief on that level before, to then suddenly find yourself managing chronic illness and managing grief. Like it's very difficult to plan for that. I think as chronically ill people, we're always planning. Or I certainly am. Like spoons, my levels of energy. If I do this today, what can I do next week? And it's impossible to do that when all of a sudden you're grieving.
I would say to me, something that really helped was accounting for how exhausting social events surrounding grief are. Because although you can't plan for how your emotions are going to make you feel, you have to kind of control the controllables. So often the controllables are, okay, well, I know I've got a funeral coming up and it can be difficult because you don't always know when that might be, or social or other memorial events, or people are around who aren't usually around. So try and plan and make sure that you still have time to look after yourself and to do the things that you need to do. And don't worry about the social aspect of, well, everyone else is doing this. Do what is right for you and what is right for your body.
I think the other thing that I learned is how much adrenaline plays a part in grief when you don't realise it's doing it. And all of a sudden you're like, I feel fine, I can do all of this. And you only figure it out after the immediate period's gone. And then I was in a massive crash. So I got through like 3 weeks between finding out my friend had died and their funeral. And I was relatively okay because there was just so much adrenaline and so much that needed to be done. And then after the funeral, I completely crashed out and I couldn't function for like a month. And I think maybe if I could do it, I don't want to do it again. It's grief. But like if I were to be in that situation again, I think accounting for how much your body tries to compensate in those situations, and blocking in some time when I had some to be like, actually, you know what, I'm just going to grieve from bed right now because there's no reason for me to be out around other people. I can watch a film in bed, do whatever feels right, I think.
I think one thing that stood out to me looking back on my own grief journey and impact on my body is the fact that it looks different from day to day as well. I think I had planned for a certain way to feel and thinking about how I would feel, and then had planned for how that would impact on me physically. But I then learned that it was quite different in terms of how it actually impacted me, and it varied from day to day as well. So some days were better or easier to cope with, and other days were definitely more difficult and more challenging. That's perhaps one thing I wish I knew, that even in planning, even with the best laid plans, things can go a little bit differently to how you might have hoped or liked.
I totally agree. I think you can't really prepare for how it's going to impact you. And actually a few months prior to my granddad dying, I got reinfected with COVID, which meant that my symptoms were escalated and I actually had to drop out of university as a result. So obviously my body was under quite a lot of pressure already. And I think even like towards the end of the year, I kind of had a different expectation that I was like supposed to be a lot better. And like, it actually took somebody recently to say, Eden, you had 3 bereavements in 2024. Like, you can't expect to be where you are prior to getting re-diagnosed with COVID and not have expected that impact on your body. Like, obviously that was going to have such an impact on your recovery, like all aspects of your life. I think it's just been really important for me to be able to accept that it's been obviously quite a challenging time, and just to accept that where I'm at right now is okay and there's like no rush. And it's just important to realise like you have to just take each day at a time.
Another thing that you don't think can be as much of a issue as it can be is traveling for like funerals or events. So like the reason that I couldn't travel at the time wasn't to do with chronic illness, but it has been with other like grief experiences since. But my sister, her life, 'cause she's an adult, she was like 27, was in Liverpool, which was like a 10-hour trip, and I couldn't go for multiple reasons. But it also does make you think that like now being ill, even having to travel, I think when my nan passed, it would have been like a 2-hour drive, but I was unwell, I was in a massive flare up, and everyone else can commute from wherever they are to make it there for this person and to show up, which then makes you feel quite guilty because it's like, I should be there.
I think it really emphasizes how isolating chronic illness can be as well, because if you are in a situation where everyone else is grieving together or everyone else is that little bit further away and you can't do that to the same extent, you can't be there for the same amount of time, you can't travel that distance for that whole period, it really highlights how isolating chronic illness can be, and then how isolating grief can be when you're surrounded by people who don't get it, who aren't going through that grief with you. Grief is horrible anyway, but that isolation on top of it can be really, really detrimental, I think. Certainly to my mental health, I find it really difficult to be watching everyone else be able to go and do all of these events surrounding memorials and stuff, and I was kind of having to pick and choose a little bit more, and that was really hard.
I would say that one of the really good things that I suppose COVID did give us was that now it's quite commonplace, I think, for funerals to be live streamed. So although it can be really hard to see people there when you can't physically be there, if you need to be involved and watch that for your own sanity and to, as part of you saying goodbye to the person you have lost, then there is a way. So if that's available, take advantage of it.
I think one thing that I would say is that I think sometimes you should be aware of the fact that you are allowed to grieve and you should give yourself time to grieve. Despite the fact that you might be aware that it might influence or increase your symptoms and cause a flare-up, it shouldn't put you off of grieving, because grieving is important, it's a natural thing and a natural part of the process. So I wish that's something that someone had told me back at the start of my grief journey, was to sort of give grief its own time and acknowledge, whilst also acknowledging the impact on my body in itself.
Definitely. I think people say there's like a timeline of grief. That's something you hear so often, is like there's 7 stages and like there's this bit of a timeline and it doesn't go away but it becomes smaller. How do you navigate that when you're chronically ill though? Because personally my like other timelines for lives don't work for me. The kind of, do you need 3 years? Do all of this? Like my illness has impacted that so much. And so it makes sense that it would impact the grief timeline as well. But that's so unique to everybody anyway, that I think it's really difficult to then be able to go, right, okay, I'm going to be at this stage of grief by this point, because that will also allow me to do, also the 7 stages are a bit rubbish anyway. Like you don't just follow through them nicely. But yeah, like it's impossible to kind of go, I'm going to feel this way on this day. And then because of that, my body is likely to be feeling this way.
For me, I found that my friend died in July, and I found I was just kind of getting through the days, and I thought I was processing what I was feeling, but I wasn't. I was just trying to survive at that point in reality. And it wasn't until the January hit, and I had some time off uni, and I finally started to feel a bit better in myself. And then that was when for me, it hit me, and it was like she had died yesterday at that point. And that was so confusing because I was like, it has been so many months and now nobody else is feeling this intensely when I'm feeling it. So if you feel it at a different point, that is fine, because sometimes you can not be physically well enough to actually process. That's fine if that happens to you, and you're not alone and you are not going crazy.
I feel like, I know we talk about it quite a bit on Winston's Wish, the 7 stages of grief. It's not stages. I think we need to rename it, because like with, all I can think of is when you do swimming lessons and you go up through the stages. With grief, we don't get a medal and a certificate once we move past each stage, because it's like a whole whirlwind, which is chronic illness completely out the picture. Anyone's grief journey can feel like not a mess, but not a straight line, not as planned out as all these visuals say. And then you put chronic illness into the mix, and the unpredictability of your body. And even when you may think, okay, I'm getting to this side of it, my thoughts are now like this, and then your physical health can go downhill, which can also then bring your mental health down as well. And it feels like trying to crawl back up to where you were physically and mentally all over again.
It really adds in this extra grief, so complicated, like you said already. And then the chronic illness just adds in this extra level of it. So I think my biggest message would be give yourself some grace here. Like, it's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things for me about grief and what I've learned is that in other areas of life, I've perhaps been kinder when I've needed more time or more support, in terms of needing that help to progress and to move forward. And I think one of my reflections is just giving yourself that bit of acknowledgement of the complexities of your health condition and how that can interact with grief. And I think one of the other interesting things about the timeline is that no one really knows when they've moved between different stages. So sometimes you think you have moved along further than perhaps you had, and there's not really any clear marker as to how you should feel at any particular moment. And I think that's something really important to stress about the grief timeline, is that it's very individualised to what happens in your specific circumstances. And I think that is something which I wish someone had told me before, that things can change and evolve, and that's natural. That happens to everyone in life when you look at situations and you perhaps view them differently based on experiences. But it definitely is more acute in the chronic illness when you're looking at timelines for grief.
I think something that's really challenging when you're chronically ill as well is that grief and death are so often very medicalized, and the chances are you know somebody who is also chronically ill, because we tend to flock together. And if the death comes within that community, be it caused by a condition that is the same or similar to you, or because of something else, but they were in that community with you, it's really difficult to kind of separate your own mortality from your grief in that moment. So my friend was chronically ill as well, and they took their own life, but that was kind of separate from their chronic illness. But the interplay, especially when everyone was talking about it, was really difficult. Like, people were like, oh, but they'd lost so much, and you're like, well, I am still struggling with chronic illness, and I absolutely do not judge them for making the decision that they made, but the narratives around it can be really unhelpful. And facing your own mortality like that, of being like, right, okay, well, they died and they were the same age as me and I'm still here. And then that can be so re-triggering in other situations where you get news or you find out more information about your condition, or something overlaps again and you're like, well, that just opens up a whole another thing and completely interrupts the grief timeline, because you go straight back to kind of being in that moment. And I think when your life is so medicalized, it does make it really difficult to kind of come through and kind of, I guess, make sense of it, because it's that much harder when it also is something that you live with.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Beth says. It's really difficult for me. My friend, we both had similar conditions and we have both gone through similar treatments. And so when she died, it was really difficult to process it. And I had a lot of feelings of, why did I get better? Why did it help me? Why didn't it do the same for her? And then for me, there was also a lot of guilt wrapped up in that I'm still here and she isn't. And that was really hard to deal with when I was grieving. I think it adds this complex layer to it that is really difficult to talk to other people about, because often people find death as an uncomfortable topic. And for me also, I found it really hard because I didn't want to talk to my family about it. So that usual support system, I didn't want to talk to about it because they'd also known Hannah and they'd also watched what had happened. So it's really complex when that happens. And I wish I could say something which is like, this is a quick fix and this is a way to deal with it. But it's going to be different for everybody. However you're feeling about it, it is okay. And don't let anyone tell you you should be feeling a certain way about it. That sentence can go for anything to do with your grief, but especially if it's someone who has had similar medical conditions to you, people going, oh, that wouldn't happen to you. It's not that comforting. And it doesn't really make you feel better. But I've worked through it, and I think a lot of the time the conclusion that I've come to is that I am still here. And at the end of the day, if our roles were reversed, I would want Hannah to live her life and to be happy. And I know she wanted that for me. So that's what I try and tell myself, because the reality is that I can't change what's happened. Don't let the fear of losing somebody discourage you from making friends and having a community, because that community has been my lifeline so many times, and it was after she died as well. It can be scary knowing, but don't let it discourage you from having those friends.
There can be a lot of indirect grief as well. Like, I know that, for instance, there was someone I followed on YouTube who had the same conditions, who died like maybe a year or two after my friend did, of the same like conditions that I've got. And again, it was kind of like this indirect grief of, I didn't know this person, but I'd turned to their online presence for advice and information and support so many times while I was navigating the beginning of my chronic illness journey. And then suddenly they weren't there anymore. And that has its own sort of set of triggers. Whether or not you've lost someone much closer to you for a similar situation, I think it's really difficult to have that indirect grief as well. But so often it takes you back to where you were with the person that you were grieving originally. Like, it just put me straight back in that situation where I'd seen that someone else had died and I was immediately back there. And I felt really selfish about that as well, because I was like, well, this person has a family who are grieving them and like friends who are grieving them. And I'm sat here also feeling grief for a person I didn't know, but also feeling grief for my friend who is not in this particular situation. But I think it's so difficult to separate those things when they're so linked to something so key to you.
I think one thing that I found personally, that people that aren't chronically ill, and maybe people that haven't grieved before, don't really understand how highly online the chronic illness community is. it has its good and it has its bad, but we are all spread out all across the country, all across the world, and it tends to be like that because of the circumstances around chronic illness. You have a lot of people who are housebound or bedbound and can't really get out much, so the community of friends is online. And then with that, you're going to have people that have the same conditions as you or similar. And something that's really, personally, I found really hard to navigate is grieving people that you have never met before. Even if it's you've had 2 conversations, you've replied to each other's messages, or you haven't even spoken in a couple months, and then seeing or hearing that someone has passed away, and it's like, I don't really know. I've had it before where I don't really know if I'm allowed to grieve it because I've not met that person. But that also links to the whole traveling aspect with chronic illness and everyone being so spread out. But yeah, grieving people who you've never met before is, I think, a strange one. But when you bring chronic illness into the mix and it's someone who has something similar to you or you are very close with like that, I think that's a lot to mentally take on.
I think one of the interesting things for me when I'm thinking about grieving people who I've never met is thinking about what would their response be and how would they want you to respond, and trying to navigate that. Would they want you to be engaging in their posts still? Would they want something different to be happening? And I think it's a really interesting point in terms of how you interact with people who are having the similar condition or had the similar condition before they sadly passed away. And also, how do you then keep their memory alive and acknowledge the impact that they had on you as an individual with chronic illness? Because I think that's something for me, is acknowledging the impact of that person. And I think in terms of grieving someone who you've never met, it's quite difficult to then understand what the difference would be if you had met them, and perhaps you feel like there would have been a difference there, and that can be quite difficult to navigate because you sadly will never meet them, and that can often be quite disappointing because you feel like you've missed an opportunity there to have a really good social connection with someone who really understood you, and I think that's definitely something that's spoken about in the community more broadly.
I think it plays into that social element of grief as well, because it's when it's someone close to you or that you've got sort of a network, a family or friends who live nearby, that social element of grief can also be really difficult with a chronic illness, but it is at least kind of brought to you. Whereas when it's someone online that you've never met and the whole community is grieving, it's really difficult to know who to reach out to for support, because I've certainly found that the people close to me, proximity-wise, don't necessarily always understand why the death of someone I've only spoken to on Instagram or like only watched videos from does hit you so hard, even though maybe you have spoken or got sort of things in common. And I think that really spread out social circle then becomes, again, really isolating when you're trying to navigate grief and chronic illness, because there are, time zone differences. Sometimes it feels really difficult to do those things, or personally, I find it really difficult to talk about those things over like Instagram messages. It feels way too personal to be putting in a bubble on a meta thing, but then that's your only sort of social connection around that grief when that person's family don't fully know how big their online support network was or how important they were. So things like streaming funerals just aren't really considered because they don't know how many people were with that person on Instagram. And I think that's a really difficult part to navigate.
Another thing with being a part of the chronic illness community as such online, and I mean on Instagram, my feed, my stories, my following is mainly people with chronic illness. I mean, I want to follow these people because we all get it and we all talk, but it can be classed as a downside where sometimes I've just opened my phone and the first thing that pops up on my feed or going through stories, and you see that someone has passed away who was in their community, whether you know them or not, whether it's a mutual of someone else, and it just hits you out of nowhere. But like personally for me, I know what some of my conditions are. I know the extent of what they can get to, but they're not that. But at the moment, and then you see other people who do get to this stage, and it kind of gives you another, like, a bit of a reminder that can happen to you as well. And I feel like events like that can really change your day, because you could be in a lecture at uni or in work or sat around family or friends, and I think it can affect you a lot more than people realize.
Grief does involve a lot of social things, as we've spoken about, and if it's somebody who you know, like for a family member, for instance, quite often you'll find that suddenly there are a lot of people around you who you might not be used to seeing, and they might not be the most understanding of your chronic illness and of what you need. And so having a lot of people around suddenly can be really, really overwhelming. I know when my granddad passed away, I found it quite difficult that suddenly, like, everybody was in the house and people say stuff, because generally people try to be helpful, but it doesn't always end up helping you. If you're able to, try and communicate that to your support system, to people around you, that you're finding that difficult, that you need some space, and don't let other people go, oh, you're going to lie down again? Go and lie down again if you need that. Don't let someone else tell you not to. You know what you need.
I totally agree, Ella. I think that, like, after time passes and maybe you've had, like, so much other stuff going on with your health as alongside, like, having to grieve and, like, process everything, it just kind of hits you. Like, I feel like for me, obviously, because I've had a few quite close together in, like, a short space of time, and I've literally only just hit the year for the first one a few months ago, so it's quite a lot to kind of comprehend and kind of get used to. But I feel like, yeah, some days you're just like, oh my gosh, like, that happened, and like, I think that's totally normal, and yeah, it's definitely a process.
I think it's also really difficult when people aren't around sort of before the big events, and then something's changed and it's really noticeable. So, like, when my friend passed, I had a nasal feeding tube at the time, and a lot of the people at the funeral were from school who I hadn't seen since I got the feeding tube, or since my health had deteriorated that dramatically. And there was a lot of attention on, like, oh my God, what's Beth got on her face? What's going on here? Like, this is new, and people were asking questions. And there was some guilt that I felt about, like, we're not here for me. This is not about this. And also, I don't want to have to explain today, of all days, what this is and why I've got it and what this means. And that, no, I don't know if I'm going to get any better. I don't know if I'm going to need it forever. I didn't want it to be about me. I would have done anything to not have people be turning the focus onto me, especially in that way. Like, I didn't want people to be doing it, but what choice did I have? It was a tube that had to be fitted under sedation in endoscopy. I couldn't just pull out for the day and then put it back in later. Like, it wasn't an accessory. It was a medical device. I think it's really important to remember that you are not responsible for how people react to you in any situation. And your disability, your illness, any physical manifestation of that accidentally draws attention to you is not something that you should be made to feel guilty for, or to have to explain on the day. I got really good on that day of going, you know what, if you're still wanting to talk to me a week from now, I will happily talk to you. But we haven't talked to each other for 2 years, and you're not going to message me a week from now. And funnily enough, I got no messages a week from then, because people only cared while we were inside that church. Probably a little bit sassier than I should have been, but given the situation, I was not really ready to save other people's feelings, which is also fine. It's grief.
funerals and the wakes specifically are highly revolved around food. It's wakes that I found are usually at a pub. They have a massive like buffet of party food, and food is such a challenging subject when you are chronically ill. I think Ella's point about, especially when it's a family member and you have suddenly lots of people around and lots of people that don't know situations because you haven't spoke to them in years, and all of a sudden to everyone else food makes you better, makes you feel better. If you're sad, have a slice of cake. They'll put food in front of you, or if you're not eating, they'll ask why and make a big deal out of it. And I feel like all you're trying to do at that point is get through the day, feel all your emotions, and all those emotions are probably making you feel physically unwell anyway, to then have someone try to bring food into the conversation. I think any advice that I would have for people about that is ignore what anyone has to say and bring your own food. If you, like myself, if you can only eat baby food sometimes, bring a little jar of baby food or your snacks. Do it, because everyone else can eat their feelings. You need to take care of your body at the same time as your feelings in a different way. And at the end of the day, half of these people you aren't going to see again. It's just for this one day where everyone suddenly comes together. Like, it's easier said than done to just ignore people and people's views, but because you've got so much going on inside your body and inside your head, you just need to try your best to focus on yourself and what's best for you.
The one thing I kept telling myself was like, people who smoke and people who vape are going to step outside during this event and no one is going to question it. So what, I can just go outside for 5 minutes. I don't smoke, don't vape, don't need to be. I can just go and sit outside so that it's not all people nagging me about food or people going, oh, how are you doing? Like, asking intrusive questions. They don't bat an eyelid if people are smoking or vaping. Feel free to step outside, because yeah, nobody would bat an eyelid if it was anybody else doing one of those two things.
Yeah, I totally agree. With what you guys have been saying, I feel like it's so important to like take time away, like the whole funeral day, like it's so overwhelming, and stepping aside, taking a moment away from things, like it's important, and just like setting those boundaries I think is really important. And like you were saying, Beth, like I know for me, like there was people at my granddad's funeral who were like asking about uni and like asking like how things are and stuff, and I was just like, oh yeah, it's great, because I didn't want to make it about me. I didn't want to be like, oh yeah, I had to drop out because of my chronic illness. Like it's really hard to navigate those like changing, like those new relationships and like old relationships coming into your life that haven't really been around. And I also found it quite hard to like see people who were like coming to the funeral and stuff, but they hadn't like really been that involved in my family's life. And I was like, okay, why are you here now? Like, I've not seen you, like my family hasn't seen you, you haven't been out through the really tough times. And it's just a bit weird like seeing people that you haven't kind of seen and haven't been there with you through that. So yeah, it's definitely like such a hard, complicated process and just very overwhelming, especially when you've got a chronic illness.
Same with stepping outside. Another thing I've seen is accessibility at funerals. And personally, in my experience, and I feel like other people might relate, is sometimes, especially if the person themselves was chronically ill or disabled, sometimes people might think that they're the only person that's going to be that way. So you don't need a pub that is wheelchair accessible, because everyone else that is going to go afterwards doesn't need that. And it's not chronic illness related, but bless one of my like uncles, he was like 80 years old in a wheelchair, and the wake happened at the lower level end of the pub, and their idea of a ramp is a really short one that just goes from A to B, so you're almost like dropping him down. But then it's whoever organises it, it's the whole thing.
That's the other thing. It's like, it feels really bad to go to someone who's organising a funeral and say, can you consider my access needs, please? Because otherwise I'm not going to be able to come. But so often places that have funerals are churches and pubs and places that are historic and not accessible. So what do you do in that? You can't be like, oh, please don't hold the funeral there, I can't get in. But at the same time, I mean, I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, but that doesn't mean that even if I've planned that I'm going to try and walk on the day of the funeral, that's what's actually going to happen. You get so used to considering accessibility every day for every other thing that you do and checking that everywhere is accessible, but you don't think, oh, is the funeral going to be accessible? That can feel really difficult to then feel stressed and annoyed about that, because you're allowed to be stressed and annoyed about access issues and not being considered, even if it's someone else's funeral. The two are not mutually exclusive, but it's really difficult to feel stressed and annoyed when it is somebody else's funeral, because my grief is not less important just because my legs don't work very well.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. And there's something that I've really thought about quite a lot, particularly in the advent of the Zoom links and the streaming of funerals that we spoke about before. I think that's a really interesting and important thing to say to people is, if you are able to articulate what accessibility requirements you may have, don't be dissuaded just because you think there would be a Zoom or a streaming alternative and you could join in that way. If you wanted to go physically, then make sure you make that voice heard and articulate for you to go in the way in which you want to attend. Because I think one of the things that highlighted to me was around getting involved or being involved in the funeral as a mark of respect, and how involved or not involved I could be as a wheelchair user in those. So I think that's a really interesting and important point to mention about making sure your voice is heard in the funeral process, and don't feel dissuaded from doing that just because there might be online alternatives in the modern world. You still have requirements and they still deserve to be heard.
I just like to agree with everybody and just say, ask about it. You could, if you don't want to have to ask that person's family, you could ring but you know where it's being held, ring those places and ask them if you're trying to kind of take some of that away. But a warning would be, if you're a wheelchair user, be wary of the graveyard and have a plan, because we live in the UK and it rains a lot, and rain and wheelchairs and mud are a very difficult mix. Yeah, advocate for yourself. Be there if you want to. Be there for as much of it as you can.
But you're also allowed to advocate for yourself to a safe person, and then they get them to do the other bit as well. Like, so much of chronic illness is advocating for yourself all the time, and it's really exhausting. And if you're in a situation where you're grieving, that may just be like the one thing you don't want to do. You are perfectly entitled to ask a partner or a parent or a sibling or someone who knows your access needs, but maybe doesn't also have to deal with the physical element of everything that you're going through, to be the one that phones or figures it out, and you can just do what you need to do to get through it. Absolutely do not let yourself be bullied out of attending funerals or wakes just because you might need an adjustment to get there. I think the other thing as well is, like, your adjustment may be, I can't be in a room full of people who haven't COVID tested, or I can't be in a room with that many people without me wearing a mask or other people wearing a mask. The one bit about chronic illness and grief that, again, you don't really anticipate until you're in it, is how much of things you do when you're grieving are things that you might otherwise have to avoid, especially if your immune system isn't great, or if you're, at risk of certain illnesses and you know that people are going to be there, who may think, oh, I've got a cold, but it's fine, I'll go because I want to say goodbye. But that cold could put you in the hospital. Like, it's a really difficult line to tread in visiting people in hospitals or in hospice, or even at home where people may not be routinely testing and like things like that. As someone who has very little immune system, knowing that people aren't testing for COVID anymore and will just come in if they've got the flu or a cold is really difficult, because you're having to consider for everybody else's decisions as well as your own. And if that's asking people to COVID test, and then only staying in that group that you know have tested, that's fine. If that's having to wear a mask at a funeral or in a hospital room, that's fine. If that's, I can only go and visit once with all of these precautions and I need to have had everyone test for everything first, that's fine. Like, you are allowed to put your health first, especially in settings that you might otherwise avoid because you'd be at risk.
When it comes to keeping yourself safe around ill people, you should also appreciate that they would hopefully have an understanding of your need and your requirements for testing and things, and that perhaps it's something that they have already done but have not necessarily communicated that to you. So sometimes when you think you're asking someone to do something that's really extraordinary or really something they wouldn't normally do, sometimes it can be things that they have already done but didn't really think it was important to mention or didn't think that you would find it helpful to know. So definitely do ask those questions around testing and mask wearing, because I think sometimes people do have an assumption or a predisposition towards doing it anyway, and sometimes you just need that confirmation. So actually it's not necessarily an ask, it's just a confirmation that they're going to do something which they already plan to do anyway.
Being chronically ill, you often have a far more intimate knowledge of the healthcare system than the normal person off the street would. You understand stuff, you understand how stuff works, you understand medical terminology. And that can be a big responsibility surrounding death and grief. And people say knowledge is power, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's a lot of responsibility, and it might be a responsibility that you don't particularly want. It can be very difficult when you know that you are the only person in the room who understands what is happening. It's okay to feel really uncomfortable with that. A lot of death happens in medical environments, and for a lot of us with chronic illness, those medical environments don't have the best memories. So having to go back to those environments can be very, very difficult. So give yourself some grace with it. If you've got to go back into a hospital, give yourself 5 minutes outside before you go in. Just take a minute, because nobody likes hospitals. I think they make a lot of people a little bit uncomfortable, but I think for us it's far more layered than that.
I think also if you're understanding what's happening and it feels like the people in the room around you aren't fully grasping what's going on because they don't have that additional sort of experience or context, it is not your job to explain that to them. It's the job of the medical staff. And if they didn't do it well enough the first time that everyone else understood, you are perfectly entitled to ask for them to come back in and do it again. It's not your job to translate things. It's not your job to have to be the person who tells your family, oh no, this is actually what this means. This is what they're saying. That is what the doctors are paid to do. And they should be the ones coming in and doing that, making sure that people understand. And if they haven't, that's on them, not on you to fix it. I know we've talked about a lot and we've some tips in there, but I wonder if everyone has just one last tip to share before we log off. I think mine would be, and someone told me this once and it made me laugh, but I found it really helpful, that you're basically like a houseplant with complicated emotions. And for someone who can't always figure out what they're feeling and what they need to do based on that feeling, that was really helpful, because actually at the end of the day, have you had nourishment? Have you had water? Have you done something that makes you happy? Got some sort of sunlight in a metaphorical sense, because I'm not going to be that person who tells you to go outside when you're sad, because we all know. But I think like that has been really helpful for me, of sort of being, right, I don't need to figure out exactly what I'm feeling right now and exactly what I need to do for this exact feeling. Maybe what I need to do is look through that houseplant checklist. And if I was a houseplant, what do I need right now? That's just the first step. And sometimes it's the next 5 seconds. It's just that first step. If you have to think of yourself as a houseplant to do it, why the heck not?
Yeah, I absolutely love your houseplant analogy. It is brilliant. My tip would be that however you are feeling, it's okay. It doesn't matter if it's not what everybody else is feeling or you're laughing because you cope with stuff via humour when everyone else is sad. However you're feeling, it's okay. And be true to yourself when you're grieving. Don't try and be somebody you're not, and don't let people and society pressure you into how you should be feeling. Just be yourself.
So I think my top tip would be that talking can be really helpful and really powerful. I think from the start of this project, I found that talking about my emotions really does help. I think even during the podcast, I've been picking up on some great ideas of things that I'll try in future. So I suppose my main takeaway would just be talk, listen to people, and also engage with your emotions. Talk about them. They are valid, as Ella says. And just have that conversation with people, because you never know where it may lead. And that may also enable you to have more of a support network as well for future.
My top tip would be just to take things each day at a time. I think it can be obviously so overwhelming, like experiencing grief, and having a chronic illness adds a whole other layer of complications to it. But just taking each day as it comes. If you don't want to do something that day, you don't have to. Just like setting boundaries and saying no. And yeah, trying to make sure that you're looking after your mental and physical health, because I feel like when we're grieving, like things can just kind of be shoved to the side. But making sure that you're doing things that mean something to you and giving yourself that time as well is really important.
I just want to say, look after yourself. As someone with a chronic illness, I've learned that people come and go, and at the end of the day, it's me, and I know how I feel. I know my body, my mind, crazy and confusing as it can be sometimes. And yeah, just look after yourself, put yourself first, no matter what the situation is, because you deserve it. You deserve love. You deserve to be taken care of. And sometimes, like with Beth's houseplant analogy, you've just got to think, like, I would do all these things for someone else, so I should do them for myself too. Thank you, guys, for this. And thank you, everyone else, for listening. This has been Grieve in Common with Winston's Wish and Teapot Trust.
This podcast is brought to you by Talk Grief, powered by Winston's Wish, the UK's first children and young people's bereavement charity.
Listen to young people from different backgrounds have honest conversations about their grief and experiences.
You might hear us laugh, cry, and everything in between. We hope that these conversations give you the confidence to talk about your own grief.
If you're grieving and over the age of 13, this podcast is suitable for you, and we hope it helps you feel less alone.
From teenagers to young adults, students to young professionals, we're all different, but we've all got grief in common. Thank you.